Justin. So jumping into the less personal questions, there's been a lot of talk and media coverage about ADHD and children recently. How pervasive is ADHD and how is it impacting children and families?
Okay, let's talk about the incidence and prevalence of ADHD. The short answer is we don't really know. And the reason that I say that is because both within Australia and across the world, we have so many different ways of assessing it. There's some really thorough assessment that goes on, and there's also some really slap happy, throw it together kind of assessment that happens. In fact, there was a report published just yesterday in Brisbane, Australia, that indicated that teachers are now diagnosing ADHD. Now, I didn't get time before we have had this conversation to look carefully at what's going on here, but essentially what the suggestion was in this report, from what I could make out, is that around about 25% of students in Queensland public schools now have an ADHD diagnosis, or teachers are saying that they've got ADHD and then sending them off to counsellors and therapists to get formal assessments, some of which are continued right through and others which are not. So we've got data purportedly indicating that 25% of public school students in Queensland have ADHD. In some parts of the United States, I've seen data indicating that a similar number at 25 to 27%. But you look at somewhere like Finland, and the numbers vary between about 1% and 3%. So globally, we've got this huge discrepancy around ADHD diagnosis. It also depends on whether you're looking at clinical samples or population samples, how we're getting what age the students are, whether we're looking at boys or girls. So there's a lot of variation when we try to understand exactly how much this is happening. Here's what we do know. And I'm going to say some provocative things that are going to be a little bit hard to hear, but this is what we know. I'm focused on facts, not ideology. Facts, we know that boys are diagnosed with ADHD significantly more than girls. I should also highlight, we're talking about both the hyperactive impulsive ADHD as well as inattentive ADHD, as well as a combined type. There is a fourth unspecified type as well, but we don't really hear very much about that. Girls do tend to show up with more inattentive diagnoses, but overall boys just absolutely, it's the number one most diagnosed psychological, neurological, or emotional. Most people agree that it's a neurological disorder. However, there is still some questions being asked about that. So I'm going to speak about it as a neurological disorder, but some people are still saying that it is an emotional or a psychological or even a social disorder. Some people still argue that it's an environmental disorder, and it could be that it might be a bit from column A, B, C, and D. Who knows? The science is far from settled, even though ideology demands that we call it a neurological disorder. Just wanted to highlight that. So we know that boys, far more than girls, are diagnosed. But here's the other thing that we know. It seems that there's a maturity element to this as well. That is, there may be something developmental. And the reason that I say that is we know that if you're in the bottom quintile, of your cohort from an age and development perspective, you're significantly more likely to be diagnosed than if you're in the top quintile. That is, ADHD sometimes shows up not because of potentially neurology, but perhaps instead because of maturity and development. We also know that kids that come from poorer households, socioeconomic status is a predictor of whether a kid is going to have an ADHD diagnosis or not. We also know that kids that are raised in homes where there is a single parent, and we also, just on that, only 4% of homes where single parents are leading the home are dads, so it's mainly single mums. Single parenting, low socioeconomic status, these seem to be predictors of ADHD and being young for your cohort. So not politically correct, not ideologically nice to hear, but overwhelmingly the data seem to point in that direction. And then we've just got the fact that...
Just a quick comment on that note, because I've got a question here that I think it's slotting well with that comment.
Yeah.
You're mentioning about predictors such as coming from a poor socioeconomic status. There was a question here from Robina asking whether ADHD is hereditary or if it's a result of trauma, or if trauma is a result of difficult ADHD. So it kind of hooks up well with the thing about coming from a socially poorer kind of circumstance. Do you know much about that?
Okay, so let's just talk about trauma for a sec. My view on trauma is a little bit... trauma has started to be talked about in new ways in the last I'm going to say, decade. Ways that it hadn't previously been talked about, and trauma is having a real moment. I guess we're talking about trauma more than ever. I was having a conversation with, I'm going to name drop here. This is my weak flex for the conversation, so forgive me. Some people might be familiar with Dr. Lisa D'Amour. She's a very, very highly esteemed parenting expert in the United States, and we were talking about trauma, and I put something to her. I just said, my sense is that trauma is fundamentally a result of maladaptive processing. And if we can help people to process the challenging events that they experience in their lives, then they will not experience ongoing trauma. That is, it may have been a traumatic event, but because of adaptive processing, because of healthy ways of working through it, they no longer experience trauma in relation to that event. You and I can experience the same event completely differently based on how well we process it. And she said a couple of wise things around that, and essentially said, yeah, that's what it is. If we can help people to process traumatic events, then they don't experience ongoing trauma. Therefore, the event ceases to be traumatic except for the moment that it happened. It doesn't have any lasting impact. This is fundamentally at odds with people like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, body keeps the score sort of stuff, who have created a trauma industry with a very limited evidence base. So I just wanted to indicate this question of trauma and highlight it in the framework that I'm going to describe it, and that is maladaptive processing. If we bring that back to ADHD, therefore, is ADHD a result of trauma? Well, if somebody is not processing well, now they're going to have problems with regulation. There's going to be self-management challenges. Their cognitions may be a little bit hazy, fuzzy, haphazard, and ongoingly, they're going to have difficulties with behavior and emotional regulation. They may be impulsive. They may be struggling. But I would generally say that is not going to be ADHD. I think that's going to be misdiagnosed trauma. I think ADHD is a completely different thing. ADHD is fundamentally an inhibition and regulation challenge. Now, that may result from trauma, but I wouldn't say that it's ADHD. I'd say it's a regulation challenge resulting from trauma. If we can get the trauma satisfied and processed well, then the regulation problems should disappear, which means that we don't have an ADHD problem anymore because it wasn't ADHD in the first place. I don't know if that's a helpful response, but that's the way that I would tend to frame that kind of a conversation.
That's helpful. Thanks, Justin. What are some of the common misconceptions about ADHD that mental health professionals should be aware of? And how can these misconceptions impact the effectiveness of treatment?
Yeah, so common misconceptions around ADHD, most of us would be familiar with them anyway because we hear them from grandmas and aunties and uncles and hardcore dads who are saying they've just got to get it together. And the misconception is basically that the child doesn't have anything wrong with them. They're just a bratty child, or they've got an attitude adjustment, or they're not motivated. So there's a question of motivation and ability with ADHD that we need to really consider. Is my child lacking motivation, or does my child lack the ability? And I love Ross Green's phrase. For those who are not familiar with Ross Green, he's a Harvard-trained psychologist who's put together something called, CPS, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. It's quite a complicated model. Our model has a lot in my model has a lot in common with his. I just think mine's simpler. It's more parsimonious. It's easy to use, but I love his work. And Ross Green says kids do well if they can. Kids do well if they can. And so he's arguing that kids are motivated and it's an ability issue. And I think that that's a really great reminder for those parents who have this misconception that they just need to, their kids need to be more motivated, because it's not a motivation issue, it's an ability issue. Outside of that, there are a lot of misconceptions that ADHD is not a thing, that it doesn't exist. I think we have enough evidence now that ADHD really is a thing, and it always has been. We just didn't recognize it. That's a really big misconception that is quite damaging. But another misconception that I want to highlight just briefly is that we need to label every ADHD child with ADHD and help them to understand what that diagnosis means. My youngest child, and just to highlight, we don't have any socioeconomic issues in my family. We have sufficient for our needs. We're not wealthy by any stretch, but we're doing okay. We've got two parents together. My daughter was one of the oldest in her cohort, and yet she scores off the charts on ADHD and She's pretty oppositional as well. We've got the Quinella, the double. We've got the double, whatever it is, and she's hardcore. I've raised 5 other daughters, and this one is nothing at all like her. ADHD is a thing. I've got firsthand experience with it. I've watched it happen, and fundamentally, it just comes down to this regulation and inhibition challenge. I mean, we could talk about misconceptions all day, but for me, they're the main ones.